Nice. We have people from Germany, India, London, and Brazil. Nottingham. Nice.
We seem to have a quite diverse audience. This is really cool.
Yeah. One from the US, Canada,
It's no Toronto.
Estonia. Nice. Netherlands, Budapest. Whoa. BH. Bacamana. Oh, nice. Edinburgh. One of my favorite cities in the world. So beautiful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Best coffee in the world from Kenya. Definitely that. Nice. Someone from France.
We'll start in 3 minutes. We are just waiting the people to come in.
Oh, someone from Spain. That's quite cool, actually, to see where people are connecting. Next time we can have a map or something.
Yeah.
Just
We
share the
just
pool.
share. Yeah.
See, for those who are still waking up, that's your chance to grab a cup of coffee before we start. But not to say that we have the majority caffeinated and ready and cozy but paying attention. Nice. We have a diverse audience in terms of background as well. Few just starting, some gaining traction, and a couple of veterans and seasoned practitioners.
But we have veterans here.
We seem to have a normal distribution.
Yeah.
Nerd jokes, the best ones. So I think we're good to start, Carol.
Yeah. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Each one is in one place. So I think wherever you are joining us from, so good something. It's really nice to see people connecting from different time zones. I think that already says something about the kind of systems we are part of, right? So welcome to the Behavioral Systems Group. For those who are new, this group explores the intersection between behavioral science and systems thinking, from big picture systems perspectives to more structure mapping and modeling approach. We are interested in understanding how behavior interacts with context, structures, institutions, multiple actors, because most of the problems which we care about, social, organizational, environmental, are not simple, right? So they are dynamic, interconnected, and shared. Let me quickly walk you through today's flow. After this short opening and introductions, we'll have about 30 minutes of conversation with our speaker. Then we will open the floor to around 15 minutes of Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. And we'll close with about 5 minutes of final announcements. We stay with us until the end. As always, this meant to be a thoughtful but relaxed conversation. So grab your favorite drink, stay curious, and let's enjoy the conversation. And with that, I will hand it over.
Thanks, Carol. So today we're really happy to have as our guest Kai Bellmann. Kai is a PhD researcher in the Multi-Actor System Department at Delft University of Technology. His work bridged behavioral insights and system analysis to strengthen the contribution of applied behavioral science to addressing complex societal challenges. And his research adopts a behavioral system approach to understand and improve policymakers' decision-making in climate adaptation. We got to know Kai through his recent published paper, which will be also the basis of today's conversation. And yeah, looking forward for that. I'll be your host today, alongside with Carol, Gabriel, and Andrea, who is joining us from the technical support part as well. And we all are part of the behavioral systems team. And I think we're good to start. Oh, just in terms of order, we will start with the conversation between us with some questions we prepared. But then feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we will be happy to make them, or raise your hands once we open for Q&A if you'd like to make them yourselves. So, okay, I think we can start also getting to know you a bit better. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you can start introducing why behavioral systems, why did you start working with this field, and how did you become interested in this area?
Yes, yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me and for taking the initiative also with this group, which I think is a very nice platform to connect people that are interested in this intersection, which is also in my view growing every day, and good to see some familiar faces and so many people joining. Yeah, my own background is quite interdisciplinary. So I started out with business psychology. Then I also studied political psychology and international relations. And then at some point, I got more into the governance and policy sciences. And that then made me, of course, think about bigger societal problems. And yeah, with that came this interest in how can we actually change structures. And I was always quite intrigued by this idea of, well, changing structures through individuals, because what I've seen in the governance sciences is oftentimes this realization there is a structural challenge, for example, insufficient finance for a topic. But then I was sometimes missing this acknowledgement that the structure is also created by the individuals that are part of the structure. So I, as a psychologist or somebody with a background in behavioral science, had the idea of, well, we need to understand these structures through the lens of individual behaviors and individual behavior change if we want to achieve system change. Yeah, so that's why I got into this, and now I'm based at Delft University of Technology, which is a technical university, and I'm part of the Multi-Actor Systems Department, as you said. So I also have a lot of colleagues that influenced my thinking in my section and in my department, who are engineers coming from very different backgrounds, and through these conversations and through getting to know their work, I arrived at this point of, well, connecting the micro, meso, and macro levels in my work.
So since the beginning of your career, you're dealing with complex challenges, as I can say. And in your paper, you argue that complex societal challenges require a systems perspective in behavior science, right? What do you see as the main added value of integrating systems thinking into behavior science?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's twofold. So I think first of all, for maybe the psychologists in the room that are familiar with this argument, we need to understand decision contexts. So I think introducing the systems perspective is one pathway to better understanding the decision-making of individuals by just looking beyond these individual level influences that we have oftentimes traditionally focused on in behavioral science, but broadening our view a bit towards the context that shapes decisions. So taking into account how other actors within a system influence individual level behavior and how that then also leads to certain dynamics that reinforce their thinking, reinforce certain social mechanisms. So I think, first of all, it's this better understanding the decision context and then also enabling us to develop better interventions that are actually tailored to people's decision context and how they actually make decisions, rather than the classic nudge approach that is it's easy, quite easy to bash it, but of course it has also a lot of advantages. But instead of taking this one size fits all solutions, developing tailored interventions that fit into existing processes, into existing practices, and that can build long-term change. Yeah, and then I think on the other hand, zooming out a bit, it's just a better understanding of a system. So understanding how elements in a system interact through this individual level. And I just talked about a lack of finance, for example, for certain infrastructure measures or certain policies. These are also decisions made by policymakers who are in turn influenced by politicians, who are in turn influenced by lobbyists or citizens, end users. So they are all interconnected, and I think it's the idea is to connect actors and better understand systems, and then hopefully discover pathways for system change. I think that's the ultimate goal also for all us applied behavioral scientists. So actually uncovering routes for change, levers in the system, and then understanding where we can intervene most effectively.
Perfect. And Kai, since we're talking about two fields of knowledge that are coming together, what about the other way around? I think you already touched on that a bit, but if you can explore a bit more, why bring behavioral science explicitly into system mapping? So what added value the behavioral lens offer to the system perspective?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and one that I had to answer quite a few times already being at the technical university. But I think we as behavioral scientists, we can be confident because there are actually things that we can bring to the table, which is, for example, or first and foremost, an understanding of what actually drives behavior and behavior change. So understanding individual level determinants and then tracing them back to the system level. And I think that's what we maybe haven't done so much in the past. So we sometimes we're quite focused on this individual level, changing individual behavior, also because our methods were mainly focused on that. But I think then introducing this micro level perspective and understanding system problems via individual level behavioral interactions, understanding dynamics, understanding social influences, and of course, then also going beyond this rational or Homo economicus view of human behavior that, although for many of us it's probably quite intuitive by now, in many other disciplines it's still not an established practice. So I think just bringing that to the table also of systems thinkers and then bringing our methodologies to the table. Thematic analysis, for example, using behavioral frameworks to better understand qualitative data. Those are things where we really have strength that I think can also help systems analysis or system mappers to improve their own methods. So I think it's not one way or the other. It really goes both ways, and that's also what your question already implied and rightfully implied. Perfect.
And I saw that this is your effort in your paper, trying to put micro and micro levels together and try to bring like a methodology to how to do it in practice. And then you present the 5 steps for developing behavior systems map. Could you walk us through this and explain the logic behind their sequence?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So I think those 5 steps, they are at the core of the paper and also of the approach, behavioral system mapping. It's very important for me to say that I'm not the inventor of this method. So my paper and also the talk today draws on a lot of existing work in causal loop diagramming, other fields, but also published work, especially from a group at UCL London that has worked a lot on behavioral system mapping. Also the European Commission and Monash University in Australia. So there are a lot of groups working on it. But I just thought it's time to take stock of the things that we are doing, stop for a minute and look at what we've already learned. So I think the most important part is that we need a behavioral problem at the start, and that's explained in the workflow, but it's not made so explicit. So I think we need a big system challenge so that this approach actually makes sense. And then the first phase of the process is the system exploration and the boundary setting. And I think the most important steps of this part are the actor scan and demarcating the system boundaries. So in this first step, in the system exploration, you need to achieve an initial understanding of the actors that are involved in the system. So understand who plays a role in the system, who is involved in the problem that I'm interested in. And I think there already lies a main difference to existing approaches, because oftentimes we start with a problem, for example, climate change mitigation. And then as behavioral scientists, we default to looking at a citizen's behavior, for example, that is involved in this. So for example, using an airplane, flying somewhere on vacation. But actually, the idea is to not start with a specific target behavior, but first start with all the actors that are involved and understand who is out there, whom could we look into, and then also generate more target behaviors that we could actually address using behavioral interventions. And then the second step is the data collection. So in this part, it's really important to focus on behaviors. And we are now also working with master students that are just developing interview guidelines for behavioral system mapping. And the key is really to focus on behaviors. And that means a behavioral process, so a sequence of behaviors, because many existing frameworks, they ask about the determinants of a specific target behavior, but just having one behavior doesn't give you a map. So you actually need multiple behaviors of multiple actors. So in an interview or in a workshop, for example, taking an airplane, you cannot just ask what influences your decision to fly somewhere on vacation, but you need to ask about the process through which this decision is reached. So how do you inform yourself? How do you talk to your family? How do you talk to colleagues about this? How are you, or with what media are you engaging? So you actually need to capture more behaviors and also behaviors of different actors. And I think that's the main part for collecting data. And then for analyzing data, it's very important to have a broad behavioral framework. At least that's my experience. So something like the COM-B or the theoretical domains framework, because it's very difficult to use a predefined model, which only gives you a very limited set of behavioral determinants. So also in my studies and my interviews, I've always found a range of different behaviors and a range of different determinants. So you really need a framework that is actually able to capture quite a set of different determinants. And there are some recent efforts also at Monash University in Australia, the socio-ecological COM-B, which introduces a few system levels to the COM-B. So you really need something that captures a broad range of influences. Then the third step, the construction of the map, which I guess is the most exciting part, but maybe also the most difficult part, and maybe we will talk about that more in this webinar as well. I think the key is to really iterate and build a map in an iterative manner, collaborate with colleagues, base it, of course, on your data analysis, but I think you also need to experiment a bit with the right level of granularity. It's important that you, of course, base it on the causal relationships that you find in your data. So for example, then I use the thematic analysis and then identifying behavioral determinants, and then you can list a lot of target behaviors or behaviors that you found in a table. That's also something I propose in the paper, but there are also other ways. So you can use participatory mapping and conduct a workshop in map or develop your map together with participants. Yes, and then it's up to the next step is the validation and refinement. And there are some that are saying that this is the most important step. And I also, in my research, really like this step because it gives you the opportunity to reflect on the findings that you have, reflect on your map, but also let your research participants or outsiders, so to say, check whether your map actually captures their lived reality. So what I, for example, did is I conducted participatory workshops with my colleagues at TU Delft, and we asked the policymakers that I interviewed in my research, also in the workshops, whether they experience certain dynamics that we found in the map, and whether they think this also influences their decision making, whether they would like to add certain variables. So yeah, this is a very important part of having this co-design aspect, and having an external check, because of course, as a researcher, you also bring certain ideas to the table. So I think it's very good idea to consult with your participants. And then the final point is the analysis and interpretation of the map. And for those that might have read the paper already, then it's about identifying feedback loops, identifying central behaviors and actors. So you actually start looking into what this map adds to your analysis, because I always like to think of this behavioral system mapping as a twofold analysis, or a twofold exercise almost. You first have this behavioral analysis of your data, so content analysis, thematic analysis that you compile in the map, which is a visualization of your findings. But then you actually go further by also analyzing the map, and then you start looking for feedback loops that emerge in the map, and you also start looking for levers that might, get you those ripple effects in the system that I'm sure many of you are also looking for. But yeah, then at the end of this process, you hopefully have a set of behavioral dynamics and underpinning behavioral determinants. You might also have some levers for change, and hopefully you have some testable hypothesis for going further or modeling interventions in the map, and some new insights on potential spillovers, connections in the system that you're interested in. Very long response.
No, but it
Sorry.
was great. It's a long response for a complex topic, let's say. And Kai, I would like to focus my question in something you said regarding the first step, which is the beginning of it all. And instead of starting, let's say, with a target behavior, when we look from a behavioral design perspective, you mentioned that we have to look at different behaviors. So define a topic, map all the actors involved, all the behaviors, and create, let's say, journey maps, journey process for each of these behaviors, and map how they connect. But the thing is, if we're dealing with complex challenges, like what's the case for most of these projects, if we go one step back and one step back and map all the actors, we might end up with how to fix the world map, right? So
Yeah.
how do
Yes.
you define the system boundaries? How do you define like what's in and what's out of the system?
Yes. Yeah, I guess that's one of the most important questions. I also don't have the perfect answer for it. There are different approaches that we as behavioral scientists can take from what exists in systems analysis, because there is a lot written on it. So there are different approaches. For example, you can adopt a more instrumental approach and just say you involve those actors that are formally involved in your problem. So then you could start looking into policy documents, or you could look into which actors actually contribute to the problem that you're interested in. And then, of course, it's up to your expertise as researcher. Or you can involve, for example, key informants and conduct key informant interviews, and ask experts about those other actors that are most relevant to this problem. Then there's, of course, also a more normative approach that you can take to this, and look into which actors are actually affected by the problem, or look into which actors you think as a researcher should be involved. Yeah, but I think as researchers, we also need to keep in mind the practicalities of our research. So sometimes it also just ends up, or you focus on the actors that you can get data on, or you focus on the actors that are readily available to you. And then the idea is to make the map as comprehensive as possible, but of course, it's just a snapshot of a part of the system, and that's something we need to acknowledge. So I think a multi-actor view is very nice. but there are certainly practical constraints. And there's a very nice book by Leon Hermans on actor and strategy models. So for those interested in different approaches to demarcating system boundaries, I encourage you to look into that book. But there are a lot of different approaches, but it's a difficult terrain to navigate.
Yeah, it's a tricky decision. We try to share with you the book that Kai just mentioned, and it's always interesting to see how ideas move from paper to practice. We've talked about the framework and the steps, but I would love to bring this to more concrete level. So have you actually applied this method in a real world project? And if so, could you walk us through an example and what insights it generated?
Yes, of course. So yeah, we are currently applying this with 2 master students and the Dutch Ministry for carpooling and flood protection. But in my own research, I focused on policymakers' climate adaptation decision making. And I started with this idea of better understanding policymakers' decision context. And then through this approach, I started to map all the other actors that influence them. And then it ended up to be a behavioral system map. But what I found, so I found 9 themes, so behavioral dynamics that shape their decision making. And one of them is a reliance on precedents. So I always use this example. So maybe there are some people in the room that have already heard me talking about this, because I think it's the most tangible one to understand what a behavioral system map can add to your analysis. So this reliance on precedents describes the phenomenon that local policymakers in climate adaptation look for examples and role models because they have the belief that they need those role models to convince local stakeholders within their municipality. So they have this assumption that they need a certain example that adaptation can be successful and also cost effective to convince, for example, local politicians or citizens that it's a good idea to invest in adaptation. And what then happens is that they start looking for those examples. And sometimes they have consultants bringing those examples in. Sometimes they consult other municipalities. But in the Netherlands, where my research was focused on, most often those local policymakers look into 2 or 3 bigger municipalities that actually have the financial means to invest in pilot projects so that can generate examples. And what then happens is that a lot of the adaptation efforts, maybe more than one would wish, in the Netherlands are influenced by what happens in those 3 big cities. And then the behavioral system map also shows what happens in those cities, so what drives adaptation there. So, for example, we saw that in those big cities, it's very specific citizens that complain about, for example, the climate adaptiveness of the area where they live. So then you see in this behavioral system map the dynamic of specific citizens in very specific Dutch municipalities complaining about a problem, policymakers in those cities creating solutions for those problems that get then adopted in the whole country. Because there are these beliefs, and this is something that we found in this research. And then you can, for example, see also the determinants of those micro behaviors that are in there. So I just said that sometimes they also ask consultancies to provide role models or examples. But this in the research we found really depends on the professional identity of the policymakers in the municipality, because some of them are of the opinion that they don't want to contact consultancies because their identity tells them I have the knowledge, or they have such a strong professional identity that they want to drive this on their own. So and then you can see how those individual level determinants, so for example, a professional identity, lead to whether one contacts a consultancy, which then leads to potential system level outcomes. But yeah, I encourage you all to look into the paper, because as you might have noticed, it's quite difficult to explain complex dynamics in a few sentences. So this paper is published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology together with Lisa Scholten and Redine de Vries. So yeah, might be an interesting read for some of you.
No, perfect, Guy. And I will now make two related questions that are connected to this practicality part, but let's go through the tools that you use. So first, what kind of tools do you use to build this map, to gather the data, or to actually like build the online map? So are there any resources that you share? And we might as well already connect with Stephanie's question here in the chat if you use any design research methods like diary studies in this process. And then the second question related to that is, okay, we can have this technical part on how to build a map and it create important insights for those that are conducting and plan to do an intervention or something. But we also have the stakeholders, we also have the other part. And truth is, when you see this map, sometimes it's a bit scary because there are so many topics and arrows related, and it's hard to communicate about it. Like it's hard to write a report about it, right? To make sure that people follow the line of reasoning. So do you have any insights on that, on how to collaborate with other participants, how to communicate that? And Stephanie is asking if you ever collaborate with visual designers to help to expose such dynamics to the research participants.
Yes, so I haven't worked with visual designers, but I would love to. So that would be great because indeed it's challenging to convey those findings. And yeah, I will start with the latter question. So communicating the findings of a map and also working with others on these maps. So what I found is really helpful also in communicating it to policymakers is to start with the findings. So start with the levers or the themes. So I've just described a theme. I could have also started with a lever and then explain them with your own words. And then you can show the paths in the map. Because if you start just showing, as you said, this big map, then it gets really difficult and people, just switch off and think this is too complicated. So what I've always done is I've started with a specific finding and then only shown parts of the map. So specific dynamical or dynamics that are part of this map. And then you can start, putting this map together also with people in a room. So my main suggestion would be to make every behavioral system mapping session somewhat interactive or focused on findings or, of course, the application, because otherwise just, showing a map and then asking participants, what do you think about that? What do you learn from it? It's really difficult. And it would even be difficult for me looking at my own map without having the background of analyzing the interview data, looking into the determinants. So I would really say breaking down the map in parts is helpful. But I think it's even more helpful to start with the findings that you actually derive from a map. So, for example, levers for change, which then in the example that I just described would be to actually provide examples to policymakers. So give them maybe a menu or a toolkit that provides them with examples, or address the beliefs that they telling them you actually don't need examples to convince your local stakeholders. So this can be a pathway. And then in terms of tools, I've used Miro quite a lot, and that worked well. I always like to start sketching a bit either by hand or on PowerPoint because it just makes it more iterative and easier to also move things around. And there are certainly a lot of other tools. So in system dynamics, people often use Vensim, and I've also tried that, but maybe for those interested also in the design aspects of the tool, that's not the right one. There's Kumu. So there are different tools. I personally really like Miro because it also gives you this interactive platform where you can collaborate with others quite easily and you can add post-it. So that's something that I like. But I'm not a design researcher and not a designer. So I guess there are better approaches to doing this.
And talking about tools, you mentioned in your paper, like directions such as integrating temporal components or linking behavior systems map with quantitative models like age-based modeling. Where do you see the greatest potential for methodological development in terms of behavior systems and behavior change?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think for me, but that's really personally for me, there are two things that I find particularly interesting. So first, indeed, this temporal component. I've recently talked with a fellow researcher that would like to use behavioral system maps to just capture meetings and then compare how interactions in meetings evolve throughout time. And I think that is really interesting because then we also get a basis for
Link
comparing maps. So
for the
we,
webinar if you want to send it to anyone.
yeah,
This-
so we could we could then actually start comparing maps. And I think that's something that we haven't done yet, or I at least haven't seen it really in the literature. So, for example, building a map for climate adaptation and then building the same map either for another country a year later, so that you can actually evolve or observe how the map evolves throughout time. And that also gives you the opportunity to observe changes that your interventions might produce. So I think adding this temporal component, maybe just a meeting a week later, or the state of climate adaptation in a country a year later. I think there are very different ways to do this, to approach this. And then the second part that I'm really passionate about, and that I will also probably further pursue in my research, is finding something like system archetypes. Because the more I talk to researchers working on similar things, I see that, for example, this reliance on precedents, you don't only find it in climate adaptation, but you find a similar dynamic also in climate change mitigation. And you might also find it for other societal challenges or conflicting political priorities. So then building a set of behavioral dynamic archetypes that you can find throughout today's complex challenges, and yeah, maybe intervention tools on how to best address them. I think those are very interesting questions for the future. And yeah, but I think, yeah, the quantification is also, of course, interesting. That's not my cup of tea, but also at TU Delft, we have a lot of researchers working with agent-based models, and it's all very exciting. But for me, those two ones that I just led with, they are the most interesting ones.
No, I totally resonate with what you said regarding the archetype types, because when you build a map, like a lot of the initial process is digging in the literature to find the determinants, what's already there, and like mapping the main components and the main actors. And maybe as this literature evolve, you already have like benchmarks for what would be a system map for this topic or this other topic, and that might help advance the area. So you don't need to start from the scratch, but rather
Yeah.
build from that. Gabi?
I'm bringing a question from the chat. So Ollie Chaplin asked, for the adaptation decision-making study, could Kai talk in a little more detail about the scoping process? What was the initial question problem they started from?
Yeah, of course. So the initial question was, what are the psychological and contextual factors that shape policymakers' decision making, and then, of course, in climate adaptation? And yeah, how we started, I started looking into policy documents. I started looking into government reports, but also into existing research to identify actors that are relevant to this climate adaptation or to climate adaptation in the Netherlands, but with a focus on policymakers' decision making. So I started then to iteratively build a long list of actors that is involved in this problem. And this then informed my approach in approaching participants for my interviews. But then I also used snowballing in the interview. So once I interviewed somebody, I asked which actors are involved in this, and is there any actor you think that we haven't covered in this interview, for example? And then building on from that, really this iterative approach of building an understanding of the system. And the scope was quite defined because I was focused on what influences policymakers, and that definitely makes it easier. So if you focus on the decision context of a specific actor, already from the start, it's easier to demarcate the system. If you really focus on this, on a big societal issue without a predefined actor focus, which is certainly possible, then you might need to set clearer boundaries in the data collection or in a specific domain that you're interested in, or just you need to build a huge map and invest a lot of time in collecting data, which would probably be a great map as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I really think it does. Thank you so much. Uh, well, let's bring another one then. I think that there's
Can I
a
just make
connection.
one question before, Gabriel?
Sure.
Because you're going to the end of the conversational part. If someone in the audience wanted to start applying behavior systems mapping like tomorrow, what would be your main advice?
Yes, I think the main advice would be following this this process, of course, but then also, you know, just try and iteratively build a map and explore behaviors. So I think for me, and we are just doing that with master students at TU Delft as well, the most important aspect is probably to talk about different types of behaviors. And that is what might be most artificial to us behavioral scientists, to not talk about a target behavior, but a lot of potential target behaviors and processes of behaviors. So if you want to start tomorrow, then start by talking to people about how they make decisions about different behaviors involved. And the determinants, at least from my experience, they are almost automatically then also in interview data, for example, because people then start telling you why they engage in a certain behavior, or you just have to ask them. But the key really is to not focus on a single target behavior, but try to capture a sequence of behaviors, and then you will be able to develop a map. At least I hope so.
And this is such a big mindset change, right? Because we are so trained to focus on a specific behavior and try to solve for it.
Yes, and I mean, what happened in my research, because I did this thematic analysis of the interview data. So I had a table of, I think, 3,200 codes or so. So just from the interview data. And then I went through all these codes and checked them for observable behaviors. And that still resulted in a few hundred observable behaviors from different actors. But that is actually, for me, that was great, because it just broadens the potential target behaviors that I could address as a behavioral scientist. And before, I would have probably just said I will develop an intervention for policymakers' climate adaptation decision making with this question that I had. But after this mapping, I actually had a much broader set of what this climate adaptation decision making actually entails, and a lot of procedural steps that policymakers take. So if you're somehow short of target behaviors, you won't be after developing a behavioral system map.
I can see that we have a lot of questions. So, Gab, can you
I think
walk us through it?
Let's pick some of them. I don't think we can answer for them all. Laura?
No, yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay.
I think interesting one is from Raquel, who asks, what's the common length of time to create a system map like this? And we can connect that with this last question from Mark, if there has been any effort to automate this building of behavioral maps with qualitative and quantitative data, like with AI. So how much effort does it take? How much time does it take, and how to make it easier?
Yeah. Interesting question. I think there's not one answer to that, because it really depends on the approach that you take to system or to behavioral system mapping. So, for example, if you're using a participatory workshop, then you could maybe manage a draft map in one workshop that only takes a few hours. And then, of course, you need to prepare this workshop, and which also takes some time. But that then is fairly a quick process. But of course, it also limits the set of things that you can take, of factors that you can take along, and of behaviors, because just capturing such a complex system in one workshop is quite challenging. So developing a behavioral system map based on interview data certainly takes a few months. So we have now master students, as I said, doing that, and they will, I think, probably take 5 or 6 months to develop a behavioral system map based on interview data. You need to process the data, you need to transcribe it. But yeah, AI certainly helps with many of those steps. So I guess there's a lot of potential there. And there are also some system mapping methods that use AI, but I personally haven't used them yet. But I think I would encourage anyone to try, because also building the map is, of course, challenging in itself.
Now for another question. How often do cultural behavior how often do cultural behaviors and semiotics play into behavior mapping? And how do you integrate it into policy making? And then this question has a piggybacking on that. What are your thoughts on adoption and the equity lens in this process? Do you think one has to go out of one's way to include minoritized population when identifying actors and stakeholders, or does it come somewhat naturally?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question that I've also asked myself. I think the behavioral systems approach itself already has somewhat of an equity lens, because you automatically start shifting the focus from actors that are typically focused by behavioral scientists. So end users, there are also Chater and Löwenstein, all these arguments about, overburdening citizens. And you're also taking into account other actors, businesses, policymakers. You can differentiate between certain groups within the population. So I think there is inherently somewhat more attention for equity issues and dynamics, and within this behavioral system mapping and behavioral systems approach, because you're broadening your view and then automatically detecting specific issues. But of course, it's still limited. So I wouldn't say that behavioral system mapping automatically makes the approach more equitable, or you're automatically then adopting a social justice perspective. I think to do that, we also need to consult other disciplines and talk to others. And then the first question, yeah, I'm not sure what is meant by cultural behaviors, but certainly what you can capture with those maps are social practices. So practices that are happening within organizations, within municipalities, within societies, because you can detect those reinforcing dynamics. And there has been quite some literature on that as well.
Perfect.
I think we have another question here that for me is like $1 million question. But he's asking how to convince policymakers that behavior is a way to tackle a problem when they don't know anything about this discipline, and most importantly, they don't want to try new approaches.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually 2 days ago attended a lecture by a researcher that started by introducing his presentation with the definition of policy. And at least in the English language dictionaries, this exercise could work. So the definition of policy is that it's supposed to change behavior. So I would lead with this. So you actually want to change behavior, and every policy has the goal to change behavior. So then it might also make sense to look at the behavioral outcomes and what drives the behavior of citizens. Yeah, but then I think this is a struggle that psychologists often have in the practical application of behavioral science. And I, of course, also encounter this. I feel like the openness is growing because we see a lot of shortcomings of the more classic policymaking tools. And then I would say equip yourself with a few nice examples of where policy didn't take into account behavior and where it did. There's a very nice report from the EU Commission, I think, Unlocking the Full Potential of Behavioral Insights, it's called. And they provide a few examples of behaviorally informed policy. And I think that really gives you some precedents that it can actually work and make policy making better. Yeah, but try to make it easily understandable and emphasize that you are also interested in changing behavior, but maybe in a less classical way.
Kai, I'd like to follow up on that last question, because when you think about like the narrative used to justify, to open the door, to convince about behavioral public policy beforehand, one of the key arguments was that it was pragmatic, that it was efficient and a quick way to maybe solve problems that were complex, but then you'd have this other approach without having to invest in structural parts. And when we look at behavioral systems, that's not always the case, right? So sometimes we're paying the focus exactly on those broader topics, let's say, that do require broader interventions. So in these interactions with policymakers, if you had a chance so far, did you see that this alternative to scores, when you talk about focus and ad systems and all the insights that it provided, do you see that there's more interest, less interest? Do you use other arguments? So doing a comparative analysis, let's say, of these two narratives, how do you feel the receptivity?
Yeah, so in a sense, I'm in a very privileged position because I'm based in the Netherlands and also interacting a lot with Dutch policymakers. And here, multiple ministries already have behavioral insights teams, and they already work with behavioral system mapping. So I know that they attend trainings that are out there from Busara and other organizations. So there's really a growing interest in this approach. And I think the main benefit that they also see is that it gives you a better understanding of what drives behavior, because they also see that behavioral tools, also what you just explained, this plug-in solution at the end to this short-term fix, that we actually need more behavioral informed policy throughout, from the start in the policy design. And behavioral system maps and this behavioral system approach can certainly give you insights into what needs to change within a system, and then also help you in different stages of the policy process, I would say. But then, yes, I didn't really have to work that hard to convince policymakers here in the Netherlands. And I think also at the European Commission, there are already people that are quite convinced. But I can very well imagine that that is not the case everywhere. And then, it's just up to us as applied behavioral scientists to demonstrate the benefit as well, and to show that it actually leads to a better understanding of societal challenges.
All right. I think we can go to our last question. What do you guys think? Sure. Marie Stage, no say, don't know if I pronounce it that's right. What were the outcomes or concrete impacts by your research? What change did it lead to after identifying leverage points? And how did you create and test any programs / interventions if you did?
Oh, yeah, that's a very nice question. I'm very thankful for that, because I did not talk about that yet. So based on this behavioral system map that I developed on the decision context of policymakers, I actually conducted a Delphi panel with experts from behavioral science and policymaking, and asked them, okay, in the system, there are these levers, and these levers are connected to different types of behaviors. And which of these behaviors do you think are impactful in the system? And which of these behaviors are also changeable? Because behaviors are, of course, also constrained by the system that they occur in. So, for example, just saying providing more financial means, it's oftentimes not really changeable, at least via behavioral interventions. So I did this, and then out of that came a set of prioritized behaviors of policymakers. And now I developed a boost, so the Climate Adaptation Reflection Navigator, which is a metacognitive checklist, so a reflection checklist that allows policymakers to check certain behaviors that we found as being important in their decision making, and reflect on them, reflect whether they connected to other departments, reflect whether there are precedents out there, for example. So these kind of things. And that is now a tool, and I've experimentally evaluated it. And at least on the individual level, it works really well. That's what we found in our experimental evaluation. I've also evaluated it together with policymakers in 2 review workshops. So asked them, do you think this will actually help you? How would you use this? And then improved it further, tailored it to their decision making. But then, of course, tracking system change, and these are the outcomes we are interested in. This is only something that that is possible after implementing it. And I'm only at the start with this and also with the project. So on the individual level, it worked. And we also think it would have these implications for the climate adaptation system. We address those levers, but then it still needs to be tested in practice.
Perfect. I loved how your intervention ended up being a boost, and I think maybe these two literatures like boost and behavioral systems would have could have or will have more interconnections as we progress with the application. And by
Yes.
the way, Mahi, who did this last question, was our last speaker, so you can check the recording in case you missed. It was also a great one. Gab, I think we can close for today. And thank you so much, Kai. It was great
Yes.
to have you here.
It's
Thank you
amazing.
for having
Thank
me.
you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. And Maristiga, I remember how to pronounce it. Thank you guys so much for coming. We had a blast with this conversation, and we love to have Kai here and so many thoughtful answers. And don't forget that we have this bi-monthly, so the next one will be in April. So stay tuned in our socials for more information, and we'll hope we will see you next time.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.
See you.